Welcome back to Sports Radio 95.9 The Fan. My name's Mark, and this is the new Mark Moses Show. Weekday afternoons from 3 to 6 p.m. Right now here on the Able Air Hotline. A very nice man I've known for a long time from the state of Virginia. Chris Graham with the Augusta Free Press covers ACC football and basketball. Chris, how you doing today?
Great, Mark. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing fine, and it's good to catch up with you. And let's start with the basketball. New teams have affected this conference, maybe for good or bad. You've added Notre Dame, Syracuse, Pittsburgh, and I know next season you'll add Louisville as well. So, Chris, for a guy who covers basketball day in and day out for the ACC, how have these teams affected the ACC basketball conference?
Well, two of the three newcomers, Syracuse and Pittsburgh, are at the top of the conference. Syracuse at 6-0 right now. Of course, they're number 2 in the country, but they're number 1 in the ACC. And the Pittsburgh Panthers are finally back in the top 25, 18-3 record overall, 6-2 in the ACC. Their losses to Syracuse, a tough game up in the Carrier Dome, and then a loss just last night to Duke. They're after stopping basically a winning streak for Pittsburgh. So Syracuse and Pitt have actually been, dominant, surprisingly maybe, in the first year of their first year in the ACC. And then Notre Dame's been a little bit of a disappointment. Notre Dame came into the season as a preseason AP top 25 team. They were picked to finish 5th in the 15-team conference by the writers in the ACC preseason. Right now at 2-5 overall. Now it's interesting. One of those 2 wins though is over Duke. So even with their struggles, Notre Dame has actually had something of an impact on this race. But right now, Syracuse and Pitt are real deals. Now we'll see this week just how much that will continue. Their first real test on Tobacco Road. Pittsburgh, of course, losing last night to Duke. Syracuse will play Duke on Saturday, and then Virginia plays Pitt. Virginia, the team right now that's sitting in second place in the ACC, will play at Pitt on Sunday. So we'll see how Syracuse and Pitt will fare through their first real tough week of test in ACC play, but so far, so good for the new teams coming into the ACC.
Well, then you'll have Louisville. I mean, they're the defending national champion. How will that affect the conference? I mean, does this make it just one of those murderers row if you're an ACC team?
I think so. You talk about adding Louisville, not just in basketball, but really across the board. Of course, football, they won 12 games this year. The Cardinals did. Baseball, they were in a College World Series last year. But in basketball, no question, Louisville will just ratchet it up even more. You talk about, you're going to have a conference with Syracuse, Louisville, Duke, North Carolina, Notre Dame, Virginia, Wake Forest, Florida State, teams that have traditionally done really well. Louisville's only going to add to that mix, and it's going to be really interesting to see, those ACC tournaments when you replace basically Maryland, which has been struggling in recent years, especially in basketball. When you replace Maryland with Louisville, oh wow, what's already maybe the best conference in college basketball this year when you look at the RPI top to bottom. It's going to clearly be that much better next year when Louisville comes in.
Are people in that region, North Carolina, Virginia, the real rivals for Maryland, are they sad that Maryland is leaving, or are they just like, bye, see you later?
I think it's a bye, see you later kind of thing up here. We've had Maryland. Maryland was a charter member of the conference dating back to, I think, 1952, 1953 when the conference was formed out of the old Southern Conference. I mean, you're talking about a long, long tradition, over 60 years. But Maryland, the decision to leave, it was made, about a year and a half ago. Basically Maryland on the road since has, the fans have home fans when Maryland comes to town have greeted them with even more venom. You have a certain amount built up just because you're rivals for so many years, but this departure to the Big Ten has definitely ratcheted that pressure up for Maryland teams who are playing on the road. And really, now at this point, when Maryland plays in your gym, and of course this spring when they play lacrosse and baseball against your schools, that's the last time you'll see them. So yeah, it's not been positive for Maryland out there. Their fan base has always been a very aggressive fan base anyway, so it's kind of like, even if they're not your number one rival, Maryland has always been a fun team to play because the fan bases always get into it so much. But it's had a different feel the last couple of years.
See, I like how, let's say you're a Virginia Tech fan. You're like, oh, are we going to play Maryland? No, they're taking on Iowa this weekend. Sorry. I mean, is that what's going to happen now?
It'll be. I can't imagine being a Maryland fan, because when you talk about Maryland leaving the ACC, for them they played, dating back to, and we talk about basketball, dating back to the '70s when NC State was a big rival, when they had John Lucas and Tom McMillan competing for national championships. You go back to the '80s and Lefty Driesell competing with Duke in North Carolina, all the way through to when Gary Williams had that team winning national championships in the early part of the 2000 decade. their rivals have been Duke and Virginia and North Carolina. They've had some great games in past years with Georgia Tech, and now all of a sudden you've got to play Penn State, you got to play Rutgers, you got to play Nebraska, Michigan. For a few years, it's got to be tough to be a Maryland fan and get up for games because as a fan you have to kind of figure out why you hate the other team and the other school and their fans and everything else. For a while, you're not going to know who to hate, and that's going to be tough for those fans to kind of get used to. So for us, it's going to be easy. When Louisville comes in, ACC fans are going to immediately say, "Hey, that's Louisville." They're last year's national champs in basketball. They win a lot of games in football. They win a lot of games in baseball. We already don't like them, so that's easy. But for Maryland fans, it'll be tough for the next few years getting used to those new rivalries.
Very interesting. We're here with Chris Graham, Augusta Free Press. Give him a follow on Twitter at AFP Chris Graham if you like ACC basketball or football. What about Jim Larrañaga? He's superstar coach at George Mason. He goes down to Miami. They got a great team last year. Shane Larkin go deep in the tournament, but I haven't really seen a lot of buzz about them. I mean, what are your thoughts on how Larrañaga's done?
Well, last year's team, obviously, he inherited a great team from Frank Heath's group. When before Frank Heath left for Missouri and a plum job out there. And he took a deep and talented team, pretty far. He won the ACC tournament championship, got into the Sweet 16 of the NCAA tournament. Maybe underachieved a bit there with that team, Shane Larkin and that group. But that team lost its key players. Shane Larkin, a couple graduations. Kenny Kanji was a key player that exhausted his eligibility. This year's a rebuilding year for Jim Larrañaga and his group. So this is, this was expected to be a down year for Miami, and it's been a down year. That said, though, 2-5 in the conference, 2 of those losses are to Syracuse, and they played Syracuse tough both games. They ended up losing both games, but had Syracuse into the final minutes in competitive games both times. So for a team that is very young, outgunned in a lot of ways in terms of their youth and experience, depth, and everything else. I got to say, Larrañaga, even though his team's record's 10-9 right now, they're 2-5 in the conference. I got to say it's a pretty good job for Larrañaga with his group, and it's only going to get better. Up here in Virginia, we know a lot of Jim Larrañaga. Of course, he was an assistant coach at Virginia back in the 80s during the Ralph Sampson era, which was a big era for Virginia basketball. Then, of course, his run at George Mason took him to the Final Four in 2006. And a lot of people pay attention to that Final Four run in 2006, but Larrañaga was consistently an NCAA tournament team for several years at George Mason. And, he knows how to coach winning basketball. He'll get Miami back on track after this season. I fully expect with the recruiting classes he has coming in, both next year and even looking at the future from potential commits down the road, I think Miami's going to be there. He's a good coach to build a program around.
Chris, let's switch gears. Let's talk some football. And I want to ask you about Russell Wilson, the man from Richmond, Virginia. Now he's going to be starting the Super Bowl, and he's had a crazy journey to get there. I want to ask you this. Was he recruited by Virginia Tech or Virginia to stay in state to play quarterback?
He was recruited by both. He had more interest in NC State because Tom O'Brien was the coach there. Now, ironically, Tom O'Brien is now an assistant coach at Virginia, but Tom O'Brien was the head coach at NC State when he was being recruited there, and O'Brien had a successful record both at UVA as an assistant coach with some pro quarterbacks, including the development of guys like Aaron Brooks, Sean Moore. I mean, as a coach at Boston College, then before he went to NC State, Tom O'Brien was a key part of the development of Matt Ryan, a future NFL #1 pick. So Russell Wilson was more. It was more like Virginia Tech lost out because Russell Wilson wanted to go to a school with a coach who had a great reputation of developing quarterbacks. Now that said, then Tom O'Brien makes the fateful decision. After Russell Wilson's junior year at NC State, Russell Wilson was also drafted to play by the Texas Rangers to play minor league baseball. And so he actually wanted to play a spring of minor league baseball. He was a great baseball player at NC State. So he actually, you're able to do that. You're able to play professionally in one sport in the NCAA, which is kind of a weird rule, and then still keep your eligibility in football. So he played a spring of minor league baseball. Well, Tom O'Brien said, if you're not here for spring practice, you're not going to be the starting quarterback. They actually went with
Mike Glennon.
Mike Glennon, yeah, who ends up, of course, himself being an NFL quarterback. So, Tom O'Brien had an embarrassment of riches at the quarterback position, but then Russell Wilson's forced to go find another place to play football. And lands at Wisconsin, leads him to the Rose Bowl. History is made. He's a third-round pick in the draft. Now he's a starting quarterback in the Super Bowl. and that's a quick run because just 3 years ago, Russell Wilson was a quarterback without a team.
Yeah,
and he's made a remarkable turn from that point on. But yeah, Virginia Tech had a chance at him, but I don't think much of a chance because Tom O'Brien really helped develop that quarterback and turn him into what he is today.
We're here with Chris Graham, Augusta Free Press. Okay. Who's bigger in the state of Virginia then? Russell Wilson or Mr. Michael Vick? Who's a bigger superstar?
I'd say at this point it's probably clearly Russell Wilson. The interesting thing is, though, I don't know that a lot of people in Virginia realize his ties. I mean, certainly around the Richmond area, people who are familiar with him from his high school days in the Richmond area might be. But Vic, of course, he's still the guy who led Virginia Tech to the national championship game in 2000, and he had struggled this year with injuries with the Philadelphia Eagles, and eventually lost his starting job. But I think this weekend at least, I think there will be a lot of people in the state of Virginia pulling for Russell Wilson and those Seattle Seahawks. Absolutely
right. Let me end with this then. Florida State wins the national championship. Clemson wins the Orange Bowl over Urban Meyer. Is ACC football back? Like, are people running around saying ACC? I mean, what's it like exactly?
I think so. Having covered, not just Virginia and Virginia Tech, but also just the whole ACC for several years now, dating back to the early part of the 2000s decade. I've been writing every spring and then every fall about whether or not ACC football will ever be relevant again. Because, when the ACC expanded in 2004, when it brought in Miami and Virginia Tech, there was an expectation that, Miami especially would raise the national profile of the ACC. Miami's just not done that. They had their issues with some recruiting violations and some postseason bans and that kind of thing. Now they're finally getting back on track. But they're still not where the ACC thought they'd be in 2004. Clemson had its own issues. Tommy Bowden was the coach. He recruited well but could never win with those guys. Now Dabo Swinney's got them winning games consistently. They've been a BCS contender for the last several years. They finally get over the hump and win a game this year. Florida State with Jimbo Fisher. I mean, when Jimbo took that program over, Florida State, it's hard to say that winning 8 games is a fallback, but the last couple of years under Tommy Bowden, winning 8 or 9 games was a come down for that program there at Florida State. And so Jimbo Fisher had sort of a rebuilding job to do. If you want to say again, rebuilding from 8 or 9 wins is a rebuilding job, but to raise Florida State back to where that fan base expects that program to be was a rebuilding job. And the last couple of years, they won 12 games last year, obviously won the national championship this year. Just the fact that those two programs are so competitive. Miami's much more competitive under Al Golden. You've got some teams in this conference to build around. Again, next year you add Louisville, which won 12 games this year, 12-1 record overall, and was a BCS team last year. I think the ACC very well could be relevant again. You got those two teams at the top. I think maybe add Louisville to that mix. You talk about Miami again, Georgia Tech with Paul Johnson as the head coach there. They've been successful for several years now. I do think that the ACC it will be a major player next year and the years to come in football.
Great stuff. Chris Graham, Augusta Free Press. They need to get you on the promotional videos when they're trying to sell the conference. That was fantastic.
I will do my part to continue to promote the ACC. Love the conference, love the sports.
Well, Chris, appreciate your help, and I hope I can get you on again.
Thank you, Mark.